So there I was, operating my road roller on the creek bed behind my property, when this silver Mercedes pulls up like she owns the entire county. Out steps Linda, you know the type. Perfectly styled blonde hair, designer yoga pants, and that HOA badge dangling from her neck like some kind of sheriff's star. She starts marching toward me, waving her arms like she's directing airport traffic, screaming about permits and environmental violations. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there thinking, lady, do you see the actual sheriff standing right next to me? Because here's the thing. Sheriff Martinez had been on site with me for the past hour, watching me clear the debris that had been blocking our neighborhood's drainage for months. The same drainage issue that Linda's HOA had been ignoring despite dozens of complaints from residents whose basements were flooding every time it rained. But Linda, she didn't even notice the patrol car. She was too busy practicing her HOA president power trip to see that she was about to make the mistake of her entire suburban reign. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up in this situation 6 months ago. My wife Sarah and I finally bought our dream home. Nothing fancy, just a modest two-story house on Creek Valley Drive with a big backyard that slopes down to Willow Creek. The realtor called it waterfront property. I called it the place where I can finally have some peace and quiet. The creek was what sold me on the house. Picture this, a gentle stream about 20 feet wide, lined with oak trees and wildflowers. In the mornings, I'd sit on our back deck with my coffee, watching the water flow past while listening to the birds wake up. It was like having our own private nature preserve. Sarah would join me out there before work, and we'd talk about all the projects we wanted to tackle, maybe a small dock for fishing, definitely a fire pit for summer evenings. We even talked about getting a kayak to paddle downstream on weekends. For the first 2 months, it was perfect, exactly what we dreamed of when we were stuck in that cramped apartment downtown, listening to sirens and honking horns all night. But then the rains came. It started in late March. We got hit with a week of heavy spring storms, the kind that turn gutters into rivers and make you grateful for a good roof. I was actually enjoying it at first. There's something peaceful about heavy rain when you're safe and dry inside your own home. But on the third day, I noticed the creek was running higher than usual. A lot higher. The water was almost reaching the base of our slope, which according to our neighbors had never happened before. By day 5, I was getting worried. The creek had risen another 2 feet, and I could see debris, branches, plastic bottles, even what looked like part of a fence, getting caught and creating little dams along the banks. That's when our neighbor, Mrs. Chen, knocked on our door. She was in her 70s, lived alone in the house next to ours, and had been on Creek Valley Drive for 20 years. The water's never been this high, she said, wringing her hands. My basement's starting to flood. I called the HOA 3 times, but they keep saying it's not their responsibility. I walked over to check her basement. Sure enough, water was seeping through the foundation walls. Her furnace was sitting in about an inch of murky creek water, and the smell was already starting to turn sour. Double quotes Mrs. Chen. You need to get this pump running and call your insurance company, I told her. But first, let's see what's causing this backup. I grabbed my waders and flashlight and headed down to the creek to investigate. What I found made me angry. About 100 yards downstream from our properties, the creek made a sharp bend, and, right at that bend, someone had basically created a dam out of negligence. There were fallen trees that had been left to rot across the stream, piles of brush and debris that had been washed down from upstream developments, shopping carts, chunks of concrete, even an old refrigerator that had somehow ended up wedged between 2 boulders. The water was backing up behind this mess, creating a lake where there should have been a flowing creek. And all that backed up water was looking for somewhere to go, like into the basements of every house on our street. I took pictures of everything and spent the next day calling around to figure out who was responsible for creek maintenance. The city said it was the county's job. The county said it was the HOA's responsibility since we were in a planned community. The HOA said it was the city's problem because the creek ran through multiple neighborhoods. Meanwhile, Mrs. Chen's basement was getting worse. The Johnsons' two houses down were starting to see water in their crawl space. And every time it rained, the problem got bigger. That's when I first met Linda Westbrook, president of the Creek Valley Homeowners Association. I'd requested a meeting to discuss the drainage issue and hopefully get some action. The meeting was supposed to be at the community center, but Linda suggested we meet at her house instead. More private, she said. Linda's house was the biggest one in our neighborhood, a sprawling colonial with a circular driveway, perfectly manicured lawn, and more outdoor lighting than a car dealership. She answered the door in full HOA regalia, polo shirt with the community logo, khakis, and that badge I mentioned earlier. "So, you're the new resident, with all the complaints," she said. Not bothering with pleasantries, I explained the situation, showed her the photos, pointed out that multiple neighbors were dealing with water damage, asked what the HOA planned to do about the obvious drainage problem. Linda listened with the kind of patient smile you'd give to a child explaining why vegetables are actually candy. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "I've been managing this community for 8 years. The creek has always been like that. It's natural. These older homes just have foundation issues. That's not the HOA's responsibility. Linda, there's a refrigerator in the creek bed. That's county property. We can't just go removing things without proper permits. What about the fallen trees? The brush piles? Environmental impact assessments are required for any stream modification. Do you have any idea how much that costs?" I stared at her. "So, you're telling me that the HOA is just going to let residents deal with flooding basements because getting permits is inconvenient?" "I'm telling you that the HOA operates according to proper legal procedures. We can't just have residents taking matters into their own hands." Over the next month, Linda proved to be a master of bureaucratic stonewalling. Every time I submitted a formal complaint, she'd respond with requests for more documentation, environmental impact studies, engineering reports, legal opinions about liability. When I offered to organize a neighborhood workday to at least clear some of the debris, she threatened to fine anyone who interfered with county waterways without proper permits. When Mrs. Chen's insurance company refused to pay for flood damage because the HOA hadn't addressed a known drainage issue, Linda suggested Mrs. Chen hire a lawyer to properly establish liability. But Linda's power trip was just getting started. She began sending out violation notices for the most ridiculous things you could imagine. The Johnsons got fined for having their trash cans visible from the street. Never mind that pickup was delayed due to flooding, and they couldn't get the cans back to their flooded garage. Mrs. Patterson received a citation for unauthorized lawn ornaments because her garden gnomes were apparently not in keeping with community standards. I got hit with a violation for improper vehicle storage because I'd parked my truck on the street overnight while my driveway was blocked by equipment from a basement waterproofing company. It was like Linda had declared war on the entire neighborhood because we dared to ask her to do her job. The breaking point came when she sent Mrs. Chen a formal letter demanding that she remediate the unsightly water damage to her property or face daily fines. This was for the basement flooding that Linda's own inaction had caused. Meanwhile, spring was turning into summer, and we were getting those afternoon thunderstorms that are common in our area. Every time it rained, the creek would rise. Every time the creek rose, more water would find its way into basements and crawl spaces. But now it wasn't just Mrs. Chen dealing with water damage. The Millers 3 houses down had standing water in their basement after every storm. The Garcias were running dehumidifiers around the clock to prevent mold. Even the Hendersons, who lived on slightly higher ground, were starting to see moisture issues in their foundation. The whole situation was making me crazy. Here we were, a community of neighbors who could solve this problem in a weekend with some basic tools and common sense, but we were being held hostage by someone who treated HOA regulations like they were the Constitution. By early June, something interesting started happening. The neighbors were getting fed up with Linda's reign of terror. It started with Mrs. Patterson, the lady with the garden gnomes. She had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years and had never had a single complaint about her yard. When Linda hit her with that unauthorized lawn ornaments citation, she decided she'd had enough. "I've had those gnomes for 10 years," she told me when she stopped by to chat. "They were a gift from my grandchildren. And now some HOA queen bee thinks she can tell me they're not classy enough for her precious neighborhood standards." Mrs. Patterson did something brilliant. She researched every single HOA violation Linda had issued in the past year and cross-referenced them with the actual community guidelines. Turns out, half of Linda's violations weren't even based on real rules. The garden gnome citation. The HOA guidelines said nothing about lawn ornaments, just that yards should be well maintained. Mrs. Patterson's yard was immaculate, the Johnson's trash can violation. The guidelines allowed for temporary placement of refuse containers on pickup days, with no specific timing requirements. My overnight parking citation. The rules prohibited long-term vehicle storage on streets, which was defined as more than 72 consecutive hours. My truck had been there for one night. Mrs. Patterson started sharing her research with other neighbors. Word spread quickly. People began comparing notes about their own bogus violations and Linda's arbitrary enforcement of made-up rules. That's when I realized Linda wasn't just ignoring the creek problem. She was actively using the chaos and frustration to expand her power. Every time a neighbor complained about flooding, she'd deflect with some new violation notice. Every time someone asked about community action, she'd bury them in bureaucratic demands. She turned the HOA into her personal fiefdom, and she was using manufactured crises to keep residents distracted and intimidated to challenge her authority. But her strategy was backfiring. Instead of cowering under her threats, the neighbors were organizing. I'd done my research. I talked to the county environmental office, the city public works department, and even consulted with an environmental lawyer. The bottom line was this: property owners have the right to maintain drainage on their own land, and the creek bed behind our properties was actually within our property boundaries according to the survey. More importantly, I'd connected with Sheriff Martinez through a mutual friend. He'd grown up in our area, knew all about the creek issues, and was familiar with Linda's tendency to quote regulations that didn't actually exist. "If you want to clear the debris on your own property, that's your business," he told me. "Just do it right. Don't use chemicals. Don't disturb any wildlife nesting areas, and document everything in case someone tries to give you grief later." So I rented a road roller. Now, I know what you're thinking. A road roller seems like overkill for creek maintenance. But hear me out. The road roller wasn't for the creek itself. It was for creating an access path so I could get the necessary equipment down to the water level. My property slopes pretty steeply down to the creek, and I needed to be able to get a small excavator and dump truck close enough to remove the larger debris. I'd lined up everything: the excavator to move the fallen trees and concrete chunks, the dump truck to haul away the garbage, and a crew of neighbors who were just as fed up with the flooding as I was. The road roller was going to pack down a temporary access road along the edge of my property. 24 hours of work, and we'd have the creek flowing properly again. I'd even gotten Sheriff Martinez to agree to be on site during the work, just to make sure everything was done safely and legally. Saturday morning, 7 a.m., perfect weather, clear skies, low humidity, just a light breeze coming off the creek. I was already feeling good about the day. The road roller had been delivered the night before and was sitting in my driveway, ready to go. The excavator was scheduled to arrive. At 9 a.m., I had a cooler full of water bottles for the volunteer crew, and Sarah had made enough sandwiches to feed a small army. Sheriff Martinez pulled up right on schedule at 7:30. He was in his personal truck, off duty, but he'd brought his radio and was officially logging the time as community assistance. "Beautiful day for some creek maintenance," he said, stepping out of his truck. "You ready to get this done? I fired up the road roller and started creating the access path. The machine was perfect for the job, heavy enough to compact the soil, but small enough to maneuver around the trees I wanted to keep. For the first hour, everything went exactly according to plan. I had the path about half finished when I heard the sound of a car door slamming up by the house. That's when Linda made her grand entrance. She came down the slope like she was leading a cavalry charge. The silver Mercedes was parked at an angle in my driveway, blocking the path where the excavator was supposed to deliver the dump truck. "Stop right there," she shouted, loud enough to be heard over the road roller engine. "You are in direct violation of HOA regulations and county environmental codes." I shut off the machine and looked over at Sheriff Martinez. He was leaning against his truck, arms crossed, watching the whole scene with the kind of expression you'd have watching a reality TV show. "Linda," I called out, "I'm working on my own property. I've checked with the county, and everything I'm doing is legal. You don't have permits for stream modification." "I'm not modifying the stream. I'm clearing debris. You're using heavy machinery without environmental impact assessments. I'm using a road roller to create an access path on my own land." She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. "This is going to be reported to the county, the state environmental agency, and the HOA board. You're going to be facing serious fines and legal action." That's when Sheriff Martinez pushed off from his truck and walked over. "Morning, Linda," he said, tipping his hat. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" I wish I could have captured the look on Linda's face when she finally noticed the sheriff. It was like watching someone realize they'd been arguing with the teacher while the principal was standing right behind them. The color drained from her face, and for the first time since I'd met her, she was completely speechless. "Sheriff Martinez," she stammered. "I didn't see you there." "I've been here for about an hour," he said, still maintaining that calm, friendly tone. "Just making sure everything stays safe and legal." "Well, this resident is clearly in violation of—" "Actually, Linda, I've reviewed what Mr. Johnson is doing, and it's all within his rights as a property owner. He's clearing debris from his own land to address a drainage problem that's been affecting his neighbors, but he doesn't have permits. He doesn't need permits for what he's doing." The county environmental office confirmed that yesterday. Linda's face was cycling through several different shades of red. "The HOA has regulations about major landscaping projects. The HOA doesn't have jurisdiction over property owners maintaining their own land for safety reasons," Sheriff Martinez said, "especially when the HOA has been ignoring residents' complaints about the underlying problem." This is where the story gets really good. Linda, realizing that her usual intimidation tactics weren't working, decided to double down. She pulled out her phone and started making calls. "I'm calling the county environmental office right now," she announced. "We'll see what they have to say about this unauthorized stream modification." Sheriff Martinez and I exchanged glances. I was trying not to smile. "Linda," I said, "you might want to ask them about the complaint I filed 6 weeks ago. You know, the one about the HOA refusing to address a drainage hazard that's causing property damage to multiple residents." She paused mid-dial. "What complaint?" "The one where I documented that the HOA has been aware of the debris problem for months but has refused to take action. The one where I provided photos showing that the blockage is causing basement flooding. The one where I noted that the HOA president claimed it wasn't their responsibility to maintain community safety." But Linda wasn't done. While she was on hold with the county, she spotted Mrs. Patterson and the Johnsons walking down the slope toward us. "This is perfect," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Witnesses to this environmental destruction. I hope you're all prepared to be named in the legal action I'm going to file." Mrs. Patterson, bless her heart, didn't miss a beat. "Linda, I'd be happy to be a witness. I've been documenting all the basement flooding in the neighborhood for the past 3 months. I've got photos of water damage, insurance claims, and repair estimates." I think a court would be very interested to see how much money residents have spent fixing problems that could have been prevented. The Johnsons nodded in agreement. We've got receipts for 3 different pump-out services, Mr. Johnson added, plus the cost of replacing our water heater and furnace after the last big flood. Linda's face was getting redder by the minute. You're all going to be named as co-conspirators in this illegal environmental modification. That's when Sheriff Martinez stepped forward. Linda, I need you to calm down. There's no illegal activity happening here, and making threats isn't helping anyone. Threats? I'm not making threats. I'm informing residents about the legal consequences of their actions. Ma'am, what you're doing sounds a lot like intimidation to me, and interfering with lawful property maintenance could actually be considered harassment. Linda's phone call didn't go the way she expected. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but from Linda's end, it sounded something like, "Yes, I understand there's a file. No, I wasn't aware of the previous complaints. Yes, I know about the basement flooding. No, we haven't taken any action yet. What do you mean we should have addressed this months ago?" When she hung up, she looked like someone had just explained that her lottery ticket was a fake. Well, Mrs. Patterson asked, what did they say? Linda mumbled something about reviewing the situation and consulting with their legal department. I'm sorry, I didn't catch that, Mrs. Patterson said, cupping her ear. Could you speak up? I'd like everyone to hear what the county environmental office told you. Linda glared at her. They said they need to review the case file. The case file that includes all our complaints about HOA inaction. I don't know what's in their file. Well, I know what's in mine, Mrs. Patterson said, pulling out her phone. Should I call them back and ask about the status of our communities? Request for emergency drainage maintenance. Right on cue, the excavator pulled up my driveway. The operator had to wait for Linda to move her Mercedes, which she did with all the grace of someone who just realized they were on the wrong side of a very public argument. But Linda wasn't giving up. Even as she moved her car, she was making more phone calls. I could hear her talking to someone about environmental lawyers and property damage lawsuits. The excavator operator, a guy named Mike who'd been doing this kind of work for 20 years, took one look at the creek situation and shook his head. Man, this is bad, he said. I've seen drainage problems before, but this is like someone built a beaver dam out of garbage. How long has it been like this? About 6 months, I told him. Getting worse every time it rains, and nobody wanted to fix it. I gestured toward Linda, who was now pacing back and forth in my driveway, still on the phone. The HOA president thinks clearing debris requires environmental impact study. Mike laughed. Environmental impact study. Brother, the environmental impact of leaving this mess is way worse than cleaning it up. You're probably preventing a real flood emergency. The next few hours were incredibly satisfying. The excavator made quick work of the fallen trees and concrete chunks. Mike was a pro. He knew exactly how to remove the debris without damaging the creek bed or disturbing the natural flow patterns. The dump truck hauled away 3 loads of garbage that had been backing up the creek. We pulled out shopping carts, chunks of concrete, pieces of old fencing, and even what appeared to be part of a deck that had washed downstream from some upstream development. My volunteer crew, which had grown to include several neighbors who'd heard about the project, helped clear the smaller debris and brush. Mrs. Patterson brought a wagon and started hauling away bottles and cans that had been trapped in the brush piles. The Johnsons brought work gloves for everyone and took charge of organizing the smaller branches for pickup. Even Mrs. Chen, despite being in her 70s, insisted on helping. She appointed herself as the official photographer, documenting every step of the process. Someone needs to record this, she said, taking pictures of the debris piles. People need to see what was really causing the flooding. By lunchtime, the creek was flowing freely for the first time in months. The difference was dramatic. Instead of a sluggish, backed-up pool, we had a clear, fast-moving stream that was already dropping to normal levels Linda stayed for another hour, taking pictures and making notes, but she'd lost all her authority. Every time she tried to lecture someone about violations or regulations, Sheriff Martinez would politely redirect her attention to the actual legal requirements. "Ma'am, like I said, this is all legal property maintenance," he'd say. "The residents are working within their rights to address a drainage problem on their own land." Sheriff Martinez made sure to document everything we were doing, and he even helped carry some of the smaller debris up to the dump truck. "You know," he said to me as we were loading the last of the garbage, "this is exactly the kind of community cooperation that makes neighborhoods work. People identifying problems and working together to solve them," he said it just loud enough for Linda to hear, but Linda had one more card to play. As we were finishing up, she marched over to where I was standing with Sheriff Martinez. "I want you to know," she said, pointing at me, "that I'm going to be monitoring your property for any signs of environmental damage. If that creek bed shows any erosion, if there's any impact on downstream properties, if there are any fish kills or wildlife disruption, you're going to be held personally liable." Sheriff Martinez looked at her calmly. "Linda," Mr. Johnson followed all proper procedures. He consulted with the appropriate agencies. He used professional equipment, and he documented everything. If there are any environmental issues, they're going to be traced back to the original problem, the debris that was blocking the creek for months while the HOA refused to address it. "We'll see about that," Linda said, and stalked back to her car. As she drove away, Mrs. Patterson turned to me with a grin. "Well, that was entertaining." "Think she's finally done?" "I doubt it," I said. "Linda doesn't strike me as the type who admits defeat easily." I was right. But what Linda did next surprised even me. Over the next 2 weeks, Linda launched what I can only describe as a scorched earth campaign against everyone who'd been involved in the creek cleanup. She started with violation notices. Lots of them. Mrs. Patterson got hit with citations for excessive yard decorations, the garden gnomes, non-approved mailbox design, she'd painted it to match her shutters, and unauthorized tree trimming, she'd cut some dead branches. The Johnsons received notices for improper lawn maintenance. There were some brown spots where their basement flooding had damaged their sprinkler system. Unapproved driveway modifications, they'd added gravel to fill in potholes. And violation of architectural guidelines, their porch light had burned out. Mrs. Chen got the worst of it. Linda cited her for structural damage affecting community aesthetics, the water damage to her basement walls, improper drainage solutions, she put a tarp over her basement window, and failure to maintain property standards. Some of her flowers had died during the flooding. I received a stack of violations thick enough to use as kindling. According to Linda, I was guilty of unauthorized landscaping, the temporary access road for the excavator, improper equipment storage. I'd left some tools in my garage with the door open. Architectural violations, I'd installed a new downspout without HOA approval, and creating community disturbance, the creek cleanup project itself. But Linda's master stroke was calling for a special HOA meeting to address the environmental destruction and community disruption caused by rogue residents. She sent out a formal notice to every homeowner in the neighborhood, describing the creek cleanup as unauthorized environmental modification and claiming that my actions had compromised community safety and property values. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the community center. Linda clearly expected to pack the room with supporters who would demand action against the troublemakers. What she got instead was a room full of neighbors who were fed up with her behavior. The community center was packed. I'd never seen so many residents at an HOA meeting. Linda had set up her usual presentation area with a projector and a stack of papers, clearly planning to make a formal case against me and the other violators. She started with her prepared remarks about proper governance and community standards and the importance of following established procedures. Then she launched into her attack. What we witnessed 2 weeks ago was a clear example of residents taking matters into their own hands without regard for community safety. or environmental protection, she said, clicking through slides that showed photos of the creek cleanup. This kind of vigilante behavior threatens the very foundation of our planned community. She had charts showing the costs of potential legal action. She had quotes from environmental lawyers about liability issues. She had aerial photos of the creek with arrows pointing to areas where she claimed we'd caused ecological damage. It was an impressive presentation. Linda had clearly spent a lot of time and effort preparing her case. When she finished, she opened the floor for questions. I'm sure residents have concerns about the precedent this sets for future community management. Mrs. Patterson was the first to stand up. I have a question, Linda. How much money has the HOA spent on legal consultations and environmental assessments in the past month? Linda shuffled through her papers. I don't have those exact figures with me tonight. Well, I do. Mrs. Patterson sighed, pulling out her own folder. According to the HOA financial reports, you've spent over $8,000 on legal fees and consultations in the past 6 weeks. That's more than the HOA typically spends in an entire year. Murmurs rippled through the room. Those expenditures were necessary to protect the community from legal liability. Linda said, Legal liability for what? Asked Mr. Johnson. For residents fixing a problem that was flooding our basements. For unauthorized environmental modification, Linda, said Mrs. Chen, standing up slowly. My basement hasn't flooded once since the creek was cleaned. For the first time in 6 months, I can use my basement again. How is that environmental damage? More murmurs, this time with a different tone. The point is not whether the outcome was positive, Linda said, her voice getting sharper. The point is that residents cannot take matters into their own hands. We have procedures, we have regulations, we have established processes for addressing community issues. That's when I stood up. Linda, what exactly was the HOA's process for addressing the creek problem? Because I submitted formal complaints starting in March, I provided photos, documentation, and multiple requests for action. What was the HOA's response? Linda glared at me. The HOA was conducting proper due diligence. For 6 months, complex environmental issues require careful analysis. It wasn't complex. Linda, there was garbage in the creek. It was blocking drainage. It was causing basement flooding. The solution was to remove the garbage. That's exactly the kind of oversimplification that leads to environmental disasters. The room was getting restless. I could see neighbors whispering to each other, shaking their heads. Let me ask you this, I said. If the HOA had addressed the drainage problem when it was first reported, would any of this have been necessary? Linda's face was getting red again. That's not the point. Actually, Linda, I think that's exactly the point, said Mr. Miller, who'd been quietly sitting in the back. My basement flooded 3 times because the HOA refused to address a simple drainage problem. I've spent over $4,000 on water damage repairs. Meanwhile, you spent $8,000 on lawyers to punish the residents who actually solved the problem. The room erupted in agreement. Neighbors started sharing their own stories of flood damage, insurance claims, and repair costs. Linda tried to regain control. The issue before us tonight is not past decisions. The issue is establishing clear guidelines to prevent future unauthorized actions. No, Linda, said Mrs. Patterson, the issue is whether the HOA exists to serve the community or whether the community exists to serve your need for control. That's when the meeting really got interesting. The HOA election was held in September. Linda campaigned on a platform of maintaining proper standards and protecting the community from reckless residents. Her opponent, Mrs. Chen, ran on a platform of common sense leadership and putting residents first. The vote wasn't even close. Linda lost by a margin of 3-1 at the community meeting where the results were announced. Linda gave a speech about how the neighborhood was making a terrible mistake, how property values would suffer, and how future legal problems would be the fault of residents who didn't understand proper governance. Then she resigned from the HOA board entirely and put her house up for sale. Mrs. Chen turned out to be exactly the kind of HOA president our neighborhood needed. She streamlined the approval process for home improvements, eliminated most of the arbitrary fines, and focused on actual community issues like street maintenance and neighborhood safety. More importantly, she established a policy that community problems would be addressed through cooperation rather than bureaucracy. When issues came up, residents would work together to find solutions instead of getting bogged down in regulatory procedures. The creek has been flowing perfectly ever since. We've had several major storms, but the water level never gets anywhere near the houses. Mrs. Chen's basement stays dry. The Johnsons have no more water in their crawl space, and I finally got to build that fire pit I'd been planning. Sarah and I sit out there on summer evenings, listening to the creek flow and watching the stars come out. Looking back on the whole experience, I learned a few important things about dealing with HOA tyrants and bureaucratic bullies. First, know your rights. I spent weeks researching property law, environmental regulations, and HOA authority. That knowledge gave me the confidence to stand up to Linda's intimidation tactics and the ammunition to prove she was wrong. Second, document everything. I took photos of the debris, recorded dates and times of all my interactions with Linda, and kept copies of every email and formal complaint. When it came time to defend my actions, I had a paper trail that clearly showed I'd followed proper procedures. Third, find allies. Sheriff Martinez wasn't just helpful on the day of the creek cleaning. He was a crucial ally who confirmed that my actions were legal and appropriate. Having official support made it impossible for Linda to claim I was some kind of rogue operator. Fourth, don't let bullies control the narrative. Linda tried to frame the situation as responsible governance versus reckless residents, but the reality was that she was using bureaucracy to avoid solving problems, while residents were taking constructive action to help their neighbors. Finally, remember that most people are reasonable. Linda was an extreme case, someone who'd let a tiny bit of authority go to her head, but the other residents just wanted to live peacefully in their homes without dealing with flooding basements and power trip HOA presidents. This whole experience taught me something important about how communities work. Real community happens when people care about each other and work together to solve problems. It doesn't happen when someone with a clipboard tries to control every aspect of neighborhood life through threats and bureaucracy. Linda thought she was protecting the community by preventing residents from taking action, but what she was really doing was preventing the community from functioning like a community. When neighbors can't work together to address common problems, when residents are afraid to help each other because of arbitrary regulations, when leadership is more concerned with control than with service, that's not a healthy community. That's just a collection of houses where people happen to live. It's been almost a year since the creek cleaning, and life on Creek Valley Drive has settled into a comfortable rhythm. The creek still flows clear and steady behind our house. Sarah and I still have our morning coffee out on the deck, watching the water and planning our next projects. We finally bought that kayak and discovered that the downstream section is perfect for lazy weekend paddles. Mrs. Chen is doing great as HOA president. She's organized several community events, including a creek cleanup day that's become an annual tradition. The neighborhood feels more connected than ever. Linda's house sold in November. The new owners are a young couple with 2 kids who love having the creek in their backyard. They've already asked about joining the next community workday. And whenever I fire up the road roller for other projects around the property, I think about that Saturday morning when one HOA president learned that real authority comes from serving your community, not from trying to control it. So that's my story about the day Linda tried to shut down my creek project and ended up shutting down her own HOA career instead. Have you ever dealt with an HOA Karen or someone who tried to use their tiny bit of authority to make your life miserable? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Did you stand up to them? Or did you have to find creative ways to work around their power trips? And if you're dealing with a similar situation right now, remember, know your rights, document everything, find allies, and don't let bullies control the story. Sometimes the best way to deal with unreasonable people is to be so thoroughly reasonable that everyone else can see the difference. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more tales of neighborhood drama and community cooperation. And if you have your own HOA horror stories, I'd love to hear them. Maybe I'll feature them in a future video. Thanks for listening, and remember, sometimes the best way to deal with fake authority is to show what real community leadership looks like.